You're listening to Trading Places. This show is supported by Silverbird, the first digital bank for international trade. Silverbird provides European and UK business accounts for exporters from over 100 countries, giving them access to fast and easy cross-border payments with multiple currencies. Last year, the Los Angeles Long Beach port complex became famous. Dozens of enormous cargo ships lined up offshore, waiting to unload cargo as COVID caused a shortage of both trucks and drivers to take goods to their final destination. The scenes of row upon row of queued vessels at the US West Coast's only ports that have the ability to handle the new breed of megaships encapsulates both the challenges and the vulnerability that 150 years of trade growth has wrought on global shipping. It all began with the 19th century's dramatic introduction to globalization, when shipping costs fell by 20%, and the shift from sail to steam boosted global trade by an enormous 400%. Then the years following World War II saw not only an explosion of trade, but the emergence of containerization, which made shipping costs sink again by another 15%. Containerization also opened international trade to small businesses who wanted to ship small volumes of goods. Then finally we reached the 1990s, when from the liberalization of the entire shipping industry emerged the megaship, a building-sized vessel which led to trade routes increasingly concentrated into a narrow set of lanes between the fewer and fewer ports big enough to take them. Today, some 90% of the world's goods spend time in a shipping container. That's about $14 trillion worth. And maritime trade volumes are expected to triple by 2050, according to the OECD. But when COVID hit, the concentration today of trade into small networks was one cause for the enormous problems that followed, and enormous cost increases felt by SMEs around the world.
The supply chain is broken, disrupted, congested, but demand is still there. You still have 7 billion people to feed. You still have markets apart from each other. Consumption and production is still separated by water. So you still need shipping to keep the global machine work. My name is César Ducruet. I'm a geographer working for the French National Center of Scientific Research, the CNRS, in Paris. There are two main challenges. The first one would be vulnerability, and the second, organizational control.
The last 2 years have been marked by goods shortages, beginning with medical products and today encompassing everything from electronics to food. César says the creation of centralized hubs shifted global shipping from a web of many ports around the world to a dense network with fewer and fewer alternatives. But is there a single cause we can blame for today's snarled up supply chains? He says no.
This is a process which is accelerated with technological change. In the context of COVID, what we see is so much technological change during a century and a half is absolutely not compatible with a crisis like COVID. The bottlenecks and the congestion is even more acute in a context like COVID because most of the goods are transported on major mega ships between the largest ports. So if these ports are stuck with containers on the docks and trucks and large ships waiting, then you can imagine that it is very difficult for supply chain to be agile, lean, flexible, and so on. We are more and more in a system where it is extremely difficult to be flexible, actually. It is a trade-off between optimality and vulnerability. So when you develop a hub and spoke network, you bet on optimality because it will be the most optimal network to save time and cost to distribute goods between small nodes and large nodes. And you can create economies of scale. But at the same time, you make your network extremely vulnerable because if the main node is congested, disrupted, then the whole system goes down.
César, could you give me an example of one time when a main trunk line bottleneck created a catastrophe?
The vulnerability appears very obviously when, in the case of events like the blockade of the Suez Canal with the Ever Given blocking the entrance by accident. It was only temporary and it recovered quite well afterwards. But what is more important is not the impact itself, it's the fact that the system can be disrupted so easily and so fastly, only with a small distortion. Just one ship can cause so much delay. The system is vulnerable. When you see on the US coast the fact that ships are waiting near Los Angeles and Long Beach and cannot go anywhere else to deliver their goods, this is quite surprising for let's say, we are talking about the biggest economy in the world. Do they have only one port to welcome those ships? I mean, look at the coasts. It is a huge coast with so many cities. You have San Francisco, Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma, Portland in Oregon. But if you look closely, none of these ports has the capacity to welcome these huge ships. Only Los Angeles.
César told me that 5 companies control 50% of the global shipping market, including Maersk and MSC. What concentration of market control and COVID has finally allowed these companies to do is ship on demand and cancel sailings at will if a vessel doesn't have a full cargo. César, can you describe what kind of risk this level of concentration poses, especially to those small companies wanting to move goods around the world?
There is an increasing, let's say, monopoly in terms of control of the whole global transport system. Horizontal concentration keeps going on. You still have large shipping lines buying smaller ones. These smaller shipping lines were functioning with smaller vessels for smaller routes, secondary routes in the southern hemisphere, global transport companies that are merging with each other at a fast pace in shipping since the 1990s, and who control through alliances or individually an increasing share of global shipping. In parallel, the next step is vertical integration. So you have shipping lines more and more involved in logistics and land transport and port stevedoring, cargo handling operations.
So what is the next step and what does it mean for industry consolidation?
This is the first consequence of the COVID, is that you have some shippers who invested in their own fleet, for example, of smaller vessels serving their own business. So it is a reverse vertical integration where the shipper, the industrial company or distribution company decides to invest in shipping. Another aspect is that you have major shipping lines like CMA CGM or Maersk now investing in 2 new businesses. One of them is airlines. They have realized that because of the crisis, it is very lucrative now to ship light goods and high-valued goods by air. Also, another sector for shipping lines to invest is e-commerce. So they also understood that it is time for them to control the whole chain. It is a dangerous game where companies get bigger and bigger, but you also have governments which try to keep control over infrastructures and circulation. They play with this disruption to make more money, and they use this money to buy new ships. It raises the question like who owns the power to decide who has access to these goods.
China is the most obvious country that comes to mind when you ask who has the power to decide what goods are moved where, after the turmoil that followed the emergence of COVID-19 and the shipping delays caused not by China, but by its sudden shutdown of factories and the world's realization that almost all of their medical supplies were made in those production facilities. Then you've also got China's increasingly muscular foreign policy in the South China Sea and its incredibly large loans to countries to develop ports from Gwadar in Pakistan to Berbera in Somaliland, and even returning Athens port to its former glories. But is their maritime Silk Road as impressive as it looks?
It tends to follow the already existing pattern of goods flows and corridors. You see China wanting to go through the Isthmus of Kra to bypass Singapore. Or if you see China, let's say, again bypassing Singapore by going by land to reach the Indian Ocean by land directly. Or if you see China bypassing the Suez Canal by a land bridge through a rail connection through Israel. And lastly, but this project is not going to happen, is to build a new canal across Nicaragua to bypass Panama. So on the one hand, it looks like a very impressive and a very groundbreaking, but in some way it is more or less the same, a few kilometers difference. It is important in terms of geopolitical importance. It makes a difference in terms of sovereignty and political control of the infrastructure. But in terms of circulation pattern, it is more or less the same economic logic than before.
César, you also contrast China's control over shipping lanes and ports with the lack of control from Western powers, which have ceded that control over global shipping to the three biggest companies, Maersk, MSC, and CMA CGM. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
On the Western side, there is no coordination over the transport chain. You don't have a clear goal or vision for the North Atlantic. There is not a unity between the powers of the North or the South or the Atlantic. I think that China is doing in some way something that Western countries are missing.
It's not only China though. The supply chain snarl-ups of 2020 reminded everyone of how important controlling shipping is. Russia is also seeking to establish dominance over the high seas by owning the newly unfrozen Arctic shipping lanes, a route that links Asia with the Atlantic in a mere 19 days, as opposed to 48 days via the Suez Canal. It is spending billions to develop a range of megaports and supporting infrastructure such as roads and rail to create an alternative to the Suez Canal. Yet for small business, it's not who owns the trade route or the ships or the containers, but how difficult they make it to move complex or perishable goods around the world.
One of the biggest issues, I guess we could say, that we run into is that we can't be shipped via air. So that stops our product from getting from the East Coast to the West Coast in a day or two.
This is Mike Grill, Digital Marketing Director at Boost Oxygen. You might remember him from episode 2 on oxygen. You've got a very complicated product, Mike. It's near pure oxygen, which is generally very flammable. I imagine you need to jump through a few hoops in order to move it around the world.
Shipping time, it adds complexity. It also adds cost for us to take on in shipping because we have to keep all of our boxes and shipping packages up to date with different regulations and different stamps. So we have a special permit from the Department of Transportation that certifies that Boost Oxygen is not hazardous material. It has no flash point. Even if you puncture the can, the oxygen just escapes. It doesn't explode or anything like that. There's been a lot of trial and error, I think, in getting oxygen to where it is. It's a compressed gas, but it's inert. And that wasn't necessarily understood until we started pushing to have our product shipped.
For a tiny winemaker down in New Zealand, it's less a matter of having the right paperwork to get a container load onto a vessel and more one of no ships arriving at all. Erica Crawford, the CEO of Love Block Wines in Marlborough, says large companies have the clout to get their stock on the ships docking at her local port. During the pandemic, small companies had to wait their turn, which sometimes meant wine was left stranded on the docks for months.
The ships are seemingly passing us by. You ship nothing for 4 months and then everything at once. And so it's very difficult to plan your production schedules. And of course, then when it gets to the other side, especially North America, there's no truck drivers to take it to warehouses. And once it is in the warehouse, there are not enough courier drivers to take it to the accounts. Pre-COVID, we had very little trouble. The logistics was smooth and happened relatively fast. In New Zealand then, you'd load things on a ship, but it took 2 weeks to leave New Zealand. Now we had a small shipment going to Australia. I think it was bumped 7 times. So you have a bunch of orders sitting there and then literally nothing happens for 4 months. and then 5 orders go at once.
How much more expensive has it got since 2019 to ship wine out of New Zealand?
Approximately 400% up. Some people say more. So it is horrendous. One has to work with one's partners to absorb the cost, because it can't only be put on one or the other. I think we're all taking a lot of pain at the moment for hopefully a better future. Online has been the saving grace, especially in COVID for smaller brands. This year it's been amazing.
COVID costs have been a killer for businesses large and small. The boss of bioplastics maker Secos, Richard Tigoni, says delays for moving their products from manufacturing plants in Malaysia and China blew out from 2 weeks to 3 months, and prices went from $5,000 per container to up to $30,000.
So some extraordinary disruption and cost pressures in those parts of the value chain. But, we're very fortunate that we have no debt on our balance sheet. We're a business that can hold a lot of inventory. We have multiple distribution channels. We deal with the US tariffs by supplying into the US out of Malaysia. So we can avoid tariffs and we can be more competitive that way with the US market. We still supply out of China to other markets where there's free trade agreements in place.
Richard has a firm belief that innovation will start bringing down prices soon. One antidote to skyrocketing fees may come in the form of new freight futures contracts, set to be launched on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange at the end of February 2022. The idea is that by breaking open the black box of commercial shipping contracts, the promise of an extra revenue stream will force the sector into never-before-seen levels of transparency. If containers made the second boom in global trade possible in the 1950s, containers stuck at the wrong end of supply chains brought it to a crashing halt in 2020 and 2021. César says that, counterintuitively, despite the shortage of containers in key sites around the world, the collection of empty boxes meant the owners, which are not the same companies as the shippers or the ship owners, were forced to scrap more containers in 2020 and 2021 than they commissioned to build. César, what has happened over the last 2 years? Why were shippers like Richard struggling to find containers in China and Malaysia when they were piling up in the US?
The main problem behind the scarcity of containers and their price is that you had production and consumption markets closing factories and closing their ports, not at the same time. So China started to close itself right after discovering COVID on its territory, and it took time before COVID spread to other parts of the world, where again industrial chain was interrupted in terms of factories were inspected, logistics parks, ports, port cities, ships were stuck, and so on. But because of this space-time differential of closing and opening, again, you had containers stuck on either side of the transport chain. So when China reopened its exports, the importing countries were not ready to receive the huge amount of goods which were accumulating in Chinese ports to be exported. When the US received ordered goods and the delayed goods at the same time on its territory, it was not ready to handle such an amount. And later, it was also not able to re-export all these containers because many of them were empty.
No one wants to open an empty box, especially when that box is 40 feet long. Containers were a wartime innovation from World War II, when the US wanted to ship things quickly to Europe. Today, the biggest ships can move 24,000 20-foot containers, or the equivalent of a 44-mile-long freight train. The infamous Ever Given, the mega ship that accidentally blocked the Suez Canal, could take 20,000 containers. The way these enormous cargo vessels make shipping feasible for smaller traders is through those containers.
The type of reach that you have is not just very dependent on break bulk. Break bulk means you need big ports, larger drafts, and a host of other things. But at one time, you have to order a ship of 20,000 tons at least. Whereas if you're doing containers, you can do 1,500, 1,000 ton 2,000 tons, small consignments that can move. And this has also been a more recent development that supported India.
This is V. Subramanian, the Vice President of the Rice Trader publication. He says India has a strong import-export trade, unlike the US, and as a result, instead of facing an exponential growth of container prices, it's meant containerization has become viable for shipping some kinds of rice to some locations.
That question of container availability is less of a problem for India relative to its competitors. And this has actually seen container rates in India come down enough to make containerized exports a viable alternative to break bulk. This has actually supported smaller businesses who can move smaller consignments to various markets.
But that doesn't mean container prices come cheap for India's rice sellers. High-end basmati is the variety that gets the kid glove treatment and sent via container, but high prices saw basmati exports shrink over the last 2 years. Buyers are reluctant to go large and commit to a big container at current rates, just in case freight rates do suddenly sink in 2022 and they're left holding pricey rice.
And one of the things that happened, if you look, the prices have converged. So Indian price does not have that advantage anymore. So all the other prices have come more or less to a narrow band. So as a buyer, you actually have more options between countries, varieties, and price. So you can make decisions now. And what we would say probably today, the decision is going to be made by your ability to ship, shipping costs, proximity, and things like that. So this is going to allow more exporters to partake in the global trade, which is not so much of a detriment to India, but I think India has done its part over the last 2 years.
And yet containers and megaships are now, in some ways, old technology. More and more shipping regulators are imposing emissions standards, such as the International Maritime Organization, the IMO's 2020 fuel sulfur standards. And it is here where the next steps in maritime transport are being taken, with new forms of propulsion, digital monitoring systems, and even the prospect of unmanned ships. The cozy world of international shipping is set to be broken apart by digital giants, just as happened to brick-and-mortar retail, video rental stores, and taxi services. One of the more stunning sights is the return of sail ships. But these are not like any sail ship you ever imagined.
It's like having a pirate ship, but it's not using those traditional sails, soft sails made of cloth. It's like putting an airplane wing on a vessel, not to make it fly, which that would be an ekranoplane, but rather to give thrust to the vessel. It's like when in cars you have a hybrid engine. The vessel has an engine which works with marine gas oil, for instance, or low sulfur fuel oil, and then you put on top the sail, and the sail gives you thrust. So it's like having two engines on a vessel.
Cristina Alexandri Munoz is co-founder of Bound for Blue, a startup that is taking an aeronautical suction technology, that is airplane wings, and adapting them to ships. Their solution sees foldable steel sails return to the high seas, the first of which is a mere 12 metres high, but with plans for 25 and 30 metre sails to grace the largest of cargo ships. That's the equivalent of a 7-storey building.
So basically how it works, our technology is named eSail, and when exposed to the wind with the suction off, it only produces drag as with any other non-lifting structure. And when the suction is activated, a small amount of the air is sucked in, which readheres the airflow to the sail and generates enormous amount of lift with low drag. And basically when installed on a vessel, what it does is it generates this effective thrust from wind power and reduces the engine power required. When you look at sails, normal sails like the passive airfoils that are used in airplanes, the thing is that they work with a difference of pressure. Our technology also works with a difference of pressure, but the main difference is the geometry of the airfoil. It's pretty similar like an airplane wing, but changing geometries, and because you change it, the physics is a little bit different, and you have to make sure that everything stays the same.
What are your stats on emissions reductions so far?
Implementing in the whole fleet would reduce the fuel consumption of the whole fleet by around 20%, and obviously the emissions. So this is very useful for the market because they have to adapt to the transition to a new regulatory framework, such as the ERI, the EXI, the CII, or the IMO CO2 goals for 2030 and 2050. And at the same time, they have to minimize their operating expenses because fuel is their highest operating expense. So it accounts around 60% of their costs.
Other future fuels include liquefied natural gas, bio-LNG, e-methane, green hydrogen, green ammonia, and low-carbon methanol. But almost all of these are still under investigation. In the case of green hydrogen, a significant enough industry to supply ships at scale is at minimum 30 years away. Christina says the true fuel of shipping is collaboration, because just as the top 5 shipping companies tighten their stranglehold on global routes, digital companies and startups like Bound for Blue are nibbling at the edges.
So there are a lot of opportunities, and not only in terms of decarbonization. So shipping is going through a huge technological transformation, just like the automotive and aviation industry. We're talking about a very traditional industry, and up till today, its players were more focused on their business. So they were not investing huge amounts on R&D. And now there are being like these new blue ocean opportunities appearing in the industry, not only in terms of wind propulsion and generally speaking in decarbonization, but in other segments. And they are disrupting it. And this is seen, in fact, by the exponential growth of the number of M&As. And in fact, more precisely, during the last years, there has been like a 5-fold increase in the number of M&As, which in fact, that's really curious because we are starting to see even VCs stepping inside the industry, big companies and corporates, which were really aside from it, working in other industries. So I'm thinking now, for instance, there was an acquisition not that time ago, and it was regarding a weather routing technology, so a software. And it was acquired by a hardware company that they offered engines. They've realized that this new transition and this new revolution in the shipping industry will not only be focused on hardware, which obviously they need hardware, I mean, vessels are needed still to navigate, but also about the software and the data that I mentioned. And obviously also there's a vertical integration going on in other industry. I saw Microsoft, they have a VC fund, and they invested in a company which is making performance monitoring. So basically they get data from the vessels and they tell the captain and the ship owner how they have to operate their ships. And in the end, maybe that happens that the engine is broken or they need maintenance. They also tell them when to do hull cleaning, which is something very expensive. And if you go hull cleaning after or before the precise moment, you can waste a lot of time and money. We're seeing a lot of players entering here.
Blockchain for cargo tracking in real time, weather monitoring, and even unmanned ships are being invented by new entrants to the shipping industry. Some of these startups are being bought up by the biggest companies, but others are remaining independent and carving out new niches. But with this new digital world comes an associated one of digital piracy. Physically, the Gulf of Guinea replaced the Horn of Africa as the world's piracy hub, but cyber attacks can come from anywhere.
Obviously, you have piracy and you have cyber attacks, and that is a huge issue. As soon as big data applications arise, one of the challenges precisely is cybersecurity. And that's why there are companies developing these technologies also to solve this problem of cybersecurity.
The situation is now so risky, given the interconnectedness of the global maritime transport sector to GPS misdirection, taking over of command and control systems, disruption attacks, ransomware, and even cyber commercial intelligence gathering, the IMO has required all shippers to assess and deal with cybersecurity risk from 2021. The global shipping industry is in a state of flux. Users are crying out for change and looking for ways around sky-high fees and a new level of unreliability. But shipping companies have traders right where they want them, needing to adapt to those high fees in the face of few alternatives. Merchants like Erica at Love Block Wines and Richard at bioplastics maker Secos say something has got to give. But history shows that change is bound to happen again and set the maritime transport industry on yet another course for for explosive growth. Thanks for listening. I'm Rachel Williamson, and you've been listening to Trading Places.